The knock came with authority before the router lights even finished rebooting. I had just changed my Wi-Fi password, a mundane fix for a problem that had been bleeding hours out of my workday. The last thing I expected was red and blue light washing across my living room walls. HOA Karen stood on my porch when I opened the door, phone raised, eyes bright with the kind of certainty that only borrowed power creates. She said I had attacked the neighborhood. She said I had sabotaged security. She said the police were already on their way. I didn't argue because her voice carried the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment. Behind her, curtains twitched and phones lifted, the block leaning forward to watch me be framed. This is how it started. Not with a crime, but with a password reset. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? The officers arrived faster than I expected, sirens cutting through the quiet like an accusation. And HOA Karen stepped aside, with a smile that told me she believed the ending was already written. She spoke first, of course, launching into a breathless explanation about cyber interference and community safety, as if she were reading from a script she'd been dying to perform. I watched the officers' faces as they listened, one older and measured, the other younger, with that familiar look that says, this isn't their first HOA call, and it won't be their last. HOA. Karen pointed at my house like it was evidence itself, insisting I had crippled the neighborhood's surveillance by changing my personal internet settings. She called it a shared network, a cooperative obligation, a safety grid everyone depended on, and she said my refusal to comply proved intent. The word intent hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, the kind people use when they want consequences without understanding. I felt the eyes of my neighbors pressing into my back, curiosity sharpening into suspicion because authority had spoken first. When the older officer finally turned to me and asked if I had changed my Wi-Fi password, I said yes, calmly, because the truth didn't need dressing up. HOA Karen let out a sharp, triumphant breath, as if that single word had just convicted me. What she didn't expect was the pause that followed, the silence where the officer waited for more, because a password alone doesn't make a crime. That silence cracked her rhythm, just slightly, enough for me to feel the balance shift even though she didn't yet. They asked to come inside, and I let them, stepping back while HOA Karen hovered on the threshold, craning to see, already narrating what she believed they would find. My office was exactly what it had always been, a desk, a monitor, a router blinking innocently beside a mug gone cold. The older officer leaned in, scrolling through the router's connected devices with practiced patience, and I watched his eyebrows lift one notch at a time. The younger one whistled under his breath, not impressed but alert, the sound of someone realizing the story they were told doesn't match the data in front of them. On the screen were multiple connection attempts labeled with a name I recognized immediately. The HOA's own network identifier, still knocking at my door long after I'd closed it. I explained the outages, the unexplained data transfers, the reason I changed the password in the first place, and how strange it felt to discover my private internet had been treated like community property without my consent. The room grew quieter with every sentence, not tense, but focused, the way professionals get when a nuisance call turns it into something else. Outside, HOA Karen's voice filtered in through the open door, still loud, still confident, still assuming control. Inside, the facts were doing something her voice couldn't, dismantling the story piece by piece without raising their tone. When the older officer straightened and asked if I would be willing to accompany them to the HOA office to verify something, I said yes without hesitation. HOA Karen heard that word and mistook it for surrender, her smile widening as if she were escorting me to a public defeat. She didn't see the looks the officers exchanged behind her back. The walk down the sidewalk felt longer than it was, every step accompanied by whispers and recording phones, as HOA Karen performed outrage for the crowd. She told anyone listening that she had acted to protect families, that she had no choice but to involve law enforcement, that people like me threatened order when left unchecked. I stayed quiet, not because I was intimidated, but because every accusation she threw was becoming another thread she'd have to untangle later. At the HOA office, she insisted on leading, fumbling with keys, narrating bylaws and authority, while the officers waited with the patience of people who know locks open eventually. Inside, The air smelled like stale coffee and laminated paper, the kind of place where control is usually exercised with fines and letters, not flashing lights. When the maintenance door opened and the monitors came into view, the performance ended abruptly. Rows of screens glowed with live feeds, not just streets and entrances, but angles that dipped too close to windows and backyards to be accidental. The younger officer stopped smiling altogether, his posture changing in a way that told me this had crossed a line that didn't belong to the HOA at all. HOA Karen tried to speak, to reframe, to call it safety again, but the word didn't land the same way anymore. In that moment, with evidence humming quietly behind her, the call she made to assert power began to fold in on itself, and the neighborhood that gathered to watch me be accused had no idea they were about to witness something very different. Before HOA Karen ever dialed 911, before police lights painted my walls and neighbors leaned forward to watch, she had already been conditioning the neighborhood for years to accept her version of authority as normal. Lakeside Grove wasn't built on chaos or neglect. It was built on routines, trimmed hedges, polite waves, and an unspoken agreement that order mattered more than questions. HOA Karen thrived in that environment because she understood something most people didn't want to admit. People will tolerate a lot of overreach if it's packaged as protection. When I first moved in, she was already a fixture, the kind of presence that didn't need to introduce itself because everyone already knew the rules she enforced. Her name came up in conversations the way bad weather does, not with outrage, but with resignation. You planned around her, adjusted to her moods, learned which battles weren't worth the paperwork. That was the authority she built, not through elections or trust, but through fatigue. I noticed it early, even before the Wi-Fi issues started, in the way neighbors lowered their voices when she walked by, in the way conversations stopped mid-sentence if her shadow crossed the driveway. HOA Karen had mastered the art of appearing indispensable. She knew the bylaws well enough to quote them selectively, skipping context, stretching language, and presenting her interpretations as settled law. If you challenged her, she didn't argue emotionally. She buried you procedurally. Notices arrived stamped and dated, violations written in language so dry and official that disputing them felt like arguing with a wall. Most people paid the fines just to make it stop, telling themselves it was easier than fighting. That's how she trained the neighborhood, not to respect her, but to avoid her. Over time, avoidance hardened into acceptance, and acceptance became authority. Her relationship with law enforcement was part of that performance. She spoke about the police the way people speak about backup, not as a last resort, but as an extension of her role. She bragged casually about knowing officers by name, about how seriously they took community safety, about how quickly they responded when she called. It was never explicit, never a threat you could point to, but it was always implied. If you crossed her, you weren't just dealing with an HOA, you were inviting attention from people with badges. That implication hung over every interaction, and most residents didn't want to test whether it was real. I didn't fully grasp how much she relied on that implied power until the day she used it against me, but the groundwork had been laid long before my router ever reset. My own background made me an outlier in her system, and I think she sensed that even before she understood it. I worked from home, kept odd hours, didn't socialize much, didn't attend HOA meetings unless something directly affected my property. To HOA Karen, that read as non-compliance. She preferred people who showed up, signed in, nodded along, and left feeling supervised. My quiet wasn't submission, it was independence, and independence always looks like defiance to someone who needs control to feel relevant. Still, I didn't push back openly at first. I responded to notices in writing, politely, with references to actual statutes when necessary, not to provoke her, but to protect myself. Each time I did, her responses grew colder, shorter, more formal, as if she were documenting a case rather than managing a neighborhood. The Wi-Fi issue didn't come out of nowhere. For weeks before I changed the password, my connection had been unstable in a way that didn't make sense for my service plan. Diagnostics showed usage spikes at odd hours, data transfers that didn't line up with my work or my habits. At first, I assumed it was a provider issue, then maybe a misconfigured device. It wasn't until I checked the router logs in detail that I saw repeated connections labeled with the HOA's network identifier, attempts that didn't belong there. That discovery reframed everything. What I'd assumed was technical noise was actually unauthorized access, a quiet assumption that my resources were available because no one had told me otherwise. Changing the password wasn't an act of rebellion, it was maintenance, the digital equivalent of locking your door after realizing someone had been walking in uninvited. To HOA Karen, though, that lock felt personal. She didn't see it as a boundary being restored. She saw it as a challenge to the system she'd built, a system where access was assumed and consent was optional. Her authority depended on those assumptions staying invisible. The moment my network went dark to her, something she relied on broke, and she reacted the only way she knew how, by escalating to an arena where she believed she held advantage. Calling the police wasn't a last resort. It was her preferred tool, the fastest way to turn a private dispute into a public spectacle, with uniforms to legitimize her anger. She didn't expect scrutiny, because scrutiny had never followed her before. In her experience, authority moved in one direction, outward, never back toward her. Understanding that context mattered later, when the story shifted and people asked how something so invasive could happen under everyone's noses. It didn't start with cameras or servers. It started with normalization. It started with small oversteps that went unchallenged because they were inconvenient to fight. It started with a woman who learned that if she acted confident enough, most people would mistake it for competence. By the time she stood on my porch, phone in hand, accusing me of cyber interference, she wasn't improvising. She was applying a pattern that had worked for years. The only thing she miscalculated was me changing something she had quietly been using all along, and the fact that this time, the authority she summoned didn't automatically belong to her. HOA Karen didn't build her control overnight. And it wasn't just personality that kept her in power, it was structure. The HOA wasn't some informal group of volunteers anymore. It was a layered system with committees, subcommittees, vendors, and contracts that most residents never read because they trusted the board to act in good faith. HOA Karen exploited that trust relentlessly. She positioned herself at the center of every decision, not by shouting the loudest, but by volunteering first, staying longest, and slowly absorbing responsibilities that were supposed to be distributed. Technology oversight became hers because no one else wanted to deal with it. Security coordination became hers because she framed it as a burden she was willing to carry. Over time, the board stopped questioning where her authority ended because they no longer remembered what it looked like without her interpreting it for them. The abuse came from how she blurred lines deliberately. HOA rules were written to manage shared spaces, landscaping, exterior maintenance, and basic community standards. But HOA Karen treated them as a mandate to reach inward into people's homes, routines, and data. She spoke constantly about safety, about rising crime, about how modern threats required modern solutions, and she used fear the way a contractor uses tools, efficiently and without apology. Cameras were introduced as deterrents, then expanded as enhancements, then quietly normalized as necessities. The fact that residents were never asked for explicit consent didn't bother her, because she believed compliance could be assumed once people were accustomed to the presence of oversight. The HOA board, many of them retirees or busy professionals, deferred to her explanations because challenging them meant work, research, and confrontation they didn't want. Her greatest weapon wasn't the cameras themselves, it was ambiguity. Residents didn't know exactly what was being monitored, how it was stored, or who had access, and that uncertainty kept them cautious. If you didn't know where the line was, you were less likely to cross it. HOA Karen cultivated that uncertainty carefully, responding vaguely to questions, redirecting concerns to bylaws few people read, and reminding everyone that the system existed for their own good. Anyone who pushed too hard found themselves suddenly buried under violation notices for unrelated issues. A trash can placed wrong, a hedge trimmed late, a vehicle parked slightly out of bounds. The message was subtle but effective. Resistance had consequences. My Wi-Fi wasn't the only resource she treated as communal by default. Conversations with neighbors after the police discovery revealed a pattern I hadn't seen from the inside. Others had noticed their internet slowing at night, their smart devices behaving oddly, their networks showing unfamiliar connections they assumed were glitches. HOA Karen encouraged that assumption, dismissing concerns as technical quirks, joking about how confusing modern technology could be. Meanwhile, the HOA office quietly accumulated hardware, servers humming behind locked doors labeled maintenance, justified as necessary for camera storage and access. Board members signed off on expenses without understanding the implications because they trusted her summaries. She had effectively centralized power without ever announcing she was doing it. The abuse intensified because it was never framed as abuse. It was framed as responsibility. HOA Karen spoke about sleepless nights, about the burden of keeping everyone safe, about how thankless the job was. She cultivated sympathy even as she overstepped, making anyone who questioned her feel petty for adding to her workload. That emotional manipulation was as much a part of the structure as the bylaws themselves. By the time I changed my Wi-Fi password, she wasn't just annoyed, she was threatened, because a piece of her infrastructure had gone dark without her permission. That exposed the truth she'd been hiding, that the HOA's power wasn't as self-contained or legitimate as she'd led everyone to believe. When the police began asking questions, it became clear how fragile her authority really was. It relied on assumptions, on silence, on people not looking too closely. The moment someone did, the entire structure started to wobble. What had seemed like an organized system of community governance revealed itself as a patchwork of overreach held together by intimidation and convenience. HOA Karen had mistaken compliance for consent and visibility for legitimacy. In doing so, she built a power structure that worked only as long as no one disrupted it. Changing my Wi-Fi didn't just inconvenience her, it exposed how much of her control depended on access she was never entitled to in the first place, and how easily that control could collapse once the right questions were asked. The moment the officers stepped fully into the HOA office and stopped listening to HOA Karen talk was the moment discovery began. Up until then, everything had been accusation and performance, her voice filling space so facts couldn't. But discovery doesn't care about tone, and proof doesn't need permission. When the older officer asked her to explain the equipment behind the locked maintenance door, she hesitated for the first time. It was a fractional pause, barely noticeable to anyone who didn't know how to read power slipping, but it was there. She recovered quickly, calling it infrastructure, calling it standard, calling it necessary. Yet each word sounded thinner than the last. When the door opened and the monitors came into full view, the story she had built for years began to collapse under its own weight. The screens weren't abstract, they weren't technical diagrams or harmless dashboards. They were real-time feeds, intimate angles, familiar spaces, driveways, backyards, side yards, patios, and in at least one case, a camera pointed far closer to a window than anyone would ever agree to. The officers didn't need me to explain what that meant. Their body language changed immediately, casual stances tightening into professional focus. The younger officer stopped reacting altogether and started documenting, eyes moving methodically from screen to screen. HOA Karen tried to narrate again, insisting these were public views, deterrents, tools meant to protect, but the words no longer matched the images. Protection doesn't look like this. Protection doesn't need to hide. Proof deepened when the officers followed the cables. Ethernet lines snaked across the floor, labeled hastily, converging on a central server rack that hummed with quiet efficiency. This wasn't a simple camera setup. It was a network, planned and maintained, with redundancy built in. One of the officers pointed to a routing configuration displayed on a monitor and asked a question HOA Karen couldn't answer without contradicting herself. How was the data being transmitted? Where was it stored? Who had access? Each question narrowed the space she could move in until she was boxed in by her own explanations. She tried to defer to contractors, to vendors, to the board, but responsibility doesn't dissolve just because you say someone else helped. The proof that mattered most, though, wasn't just in the hardware. It was in the logs. When they cross-referenced timestamps from my router with access attempts from the HOA servers, the pattern became impossible to deny. My network hadn't been accidentally involved. It had been deliberately used as a conduit. The officers explained it plainly, not for me, but for the record. My Wi-Fi masked the origin of the data, routing traffic through a private residential connection to avoid scrutiny. It wasn't clever, it was reckless, and it transformed what HOA Karen called a safety measure into something far more serious. Unauthorized access, invasion of privacy, potential wiretapping, words that carry weight in places far beyond HOA meetings. As the discovery unfolded, neighbors gathered outside, drawn by the sight of police cars that hadn't left as expected. Murmurs spread quickly, confusion turning into alarm as snippets of information leaked out. Someone recognized their own backyard on a screen through a window. Someone else realized the camera they'd assumed pointed at the street had a wider angle than advertised. The collective understanding shifted from curiosity about my supposed misconduct to dawning horror at what had been happening all along. HOA Karen sensed it too, her posture stiffening as the crowd outside grew louder, less deferential, less afraid. The power she wielded so comfortably indoors didn't extend to a group that was suddenly asking the same questions at once. When the officers called for additional units and a warrant to seize equipment, the tone changed completely. This was no longer a neighborly dispute or a misunderstanding about Wi-Fi. It was an investigation. HOA Karen protested loudly, invoking authority, jurisdiction, community rights, but each protest sounded increasingly hollow as procedure took over. Hard drives were labeled, screens were photographed, serial numbers were recorded. The system she'd hidden behind routine and familiarity was being dismantled piece by piece, not dramatically, but thoroughly. Proof doesn't rush, it documents. Standing there, watching years of quiet overreach crystallize into evidence, I felt something unexpected settle in. Not triumph, not anger, but clarity. This wasn't about me changing a password. It never had been. The discovery made visible what had been invisible by design, how easily power can slip into places it doesn't belong when no one is watching the watchers. HOA Karen had called the police expecting validation. Instead, she had invited scrutiny into a system that couldn't survive it. The proof was no longer theoretical or debatable. It was humming quietly on seized drives, stamped into reports, and reflected in the faces of neighbors who finally understood that what felt wrong for years had been wrong all along. The confrontation didn't explode the way HOA Karen always staged her victories. There were no raised voices from the officers, no dramatic commands, no sudden chaos. That absence was what unraveled her. Authority stopped performing for her and started operating around her, and the difference was devastating. As additional units arrived, and the warrant was read aloud, HOA Karen tried to reclaim the room with volume, stepping into the officer's space, demanding explanations, insisting on procedural violations she couldn't actually name. Each interruption was met with the same response: calm repetition of instructions, measured requests to step aside, reminders that this was no longer an HOA matter. Every time she spoke, she shrank a little more, not physically, but in relevance, as if the room itself were recentering away from her presence. Outside, the crowd had transformed from spectators into participants. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now leaned forward, questions tumbling out faster than anyone could answer them. Was she watching us? Did she record inside our homes? How long had this been happening? HOA Karen tried to address them through the doorway, switching tone instantly, claiming misunderstandings, promising explanations, insisting everything had been done with consent implied by residency. The word implied set people off. Someone laughed, sharp and disbelieving. Another person shouted that they'd never signed anything. A third demanded to know why their backyard camera angle was on a screen inside the office. The collective voice rose, not unified yet, but loud enough to drown out the one person who had dominated it for years. The officers moved her back, not roughly, not dramatically, just enough to create space between her and the crowd. That separation was symbolic, whether anyone realized it or not. For the first time, HOA Karen was not the barrier between residents and authority. She was the subject of it. When one of the officers explained, clearly and publicly, that the investigation involved unauthorized surveillance and misuse of private networks, the words landed like a verdict even before any court date existed. People processed it in real time, faces shifting from shock to anger to a dawning sense of betrayal. This wasn't a rogue camera or an overzealous safety measure. This was systematic, deliberate, and personal. HOA Karen attempted one last pivot, pointing directly at me, accusing me of orchestrating this, of manipulating the situation by cutting off access and forcing her hand. It might have worked once. It might have worked on a quieter day, with fewer witnesses and no evidence humming in the back room. But now it sounded desperate. The older officer cut her off mid-sentence, stating plainly that my actions were lawful, and that changing a private Wi-Fi password did not constitute a crime. That sentence did more damage than any accusation I could have made myself. It reframed the entire narrative in a single stroke. I wasn't the aggressor. I was the boundary she crossed. As equipment was carried out in labeled boxes, the physical manifestation of her control left the building piece by piece. Each box drew murmurs from the crowd, recognition dawning as people realized how extensive the setup had been. Someone spotted a label that matched their street. Someone else recognized a camera model they'd been told was for the entrance only. HOA Karen's protests grew quieter, not because she was being silenced, but because she was running out of ground to stand on. Every explanation contradicted the last. Every appeal to authority was met with procedure that no longer included her. The public collapse wasn't a single moment, it was a sequence. The police escort to the car, the crowd parting without respect, the phones recording not out of curiosity now, but documentation. HOA Karen's final words to the neighborhood were lost under the noise of people talking to each other, comparing experiences, connecting dots that had never quite lined up before. By the time the car door closed, she was no longer a figure of fear or control. She was a subject of investigation, stripped of the mystique that had protected her for so long. Standing there, watching the scene settle into something quieter and heavier, I realized the confrontation had achieved what years of complaints and fines never could. It had forced everything into the open. Power thrives in isolation and ambiguity, and both had been removed at once. The collapse wasn't satisfying in a dramatic sense. There was no applause or cheers, just a strange collective exhale as the neighborhood recalibrated itself without her at the center. The confrontation had ended not with victory speeches, but with silence, the kind that follows when a long-held illusion finally breaks, and everyone has to sit with what it means next. The retaliation didn't come from shouting neighbors or angry posts online. It came from people who understood systems better than HOA Karen ever had. Once the equipment was seized and the initial shock settled, the process shifted into a quieter, more dangerous phase for her, the kind that moves through offices, reports, and statutes rather than doorsteps. Cybercrime investigators became involved almost immediately, drawn in by the scale of the network and the deliberate use of a private residential connection to mask activity. What HOA Karen had treated as clever improvisation was recognized instantly by experts as intent. Masking traffic through an unwitting homeowner wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a calculated choice that escalated the situation far beyond HOA misconduct. I was interviewed formally the next morning, not as a suspect, but as a source. They asked about timelines, about when I first noticed irregularities, about how often the network disruptions occurred. They reviewed my logs carefully, cross-referencing them with the HOA servers now sitting in evidence lockers. Every answer I gave aligned cleanly with what the data already showed, and that consistency mattered. Experts don't need outrage. They need patterns. And the pattern here was unmistakable. The moment I changed my password, the HOA system failed because it had been leaning on my connection all along. That failure was the proof of dependency she could never explain away. The investigator spoke plainly about what they were seeing: unauthorized surveillance, data interception, potential violations of state and federal privacy laws. They explained how the feeds could be used to infer routines, vulnerabilities, habits, information no HOA has any right to collect. Hearing it framed that way stripped away any remaining pretense of safety initiatives or community programs. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood secure, it was about control through information, and experts have very little patience for that kind of abuse. Each finding tightened the net, not loudly, but methodically, the way accountability always arrives when it's real. Karen tried to respond through attorneys, issuing statements about cooperation and misunderstanding, but those words landed in rooms where logs and timestamps spoke louder. Experts don't argue intent philosophically, they demonstrate it technically. They showed how the routing had been configured, how backups were stored, how access credentials were centralized. They explained that even if no one had complained, the setup itself violated basic principles of consent and security. In those explanations, her authority evaporated completely. Titles mean nothing to people trained to dismantle systems built on shortcuts and assumptions. The retaliation became irreversible when recommendations were made public. Cease and desist orders, mandatory audits, restrictions on future HOA governance related to technology and surveillance. The board members who had deferred to her suddenly found themselves accountable as well, forced to explain why they hadn't asked questions sooner. That ripple effect mattered. It turned her individual overreach into a cautionary example, something other communities would be warned about, studied, and used to justify stricter oversight. Experts don't just punish, they prevent, and in doing so, they ensured HOA Karen's methods couldn't simply reappear under a new name. For me, the experience was strangely grounding. Watching experts dismantle what she'd built reinforced something I'd felt instinctively from the start. Boundaries aren't fragile, they're ignored until someone enforces them. The retaliation wasn't emotional or vindictive, it was corrective, a system responding to a violation with precision instead of spectacle. HOA Karen had called the police to assert dominance. Instead, she triggered a chain of expert scrutiny that stripped her of any claim to legitimacy. By the time the reports were finalized, her influence was gone, not because people were angry, but because the facts left no room for her to stand. The victory didn't arrive with applause or celebration. It arrived with quiet, procedural finality. Notices went out to residents explaining the findings in neutral language, stripped of drama, outlining violations and corrective actions without mentioning feelings or intent. HOA Karen's name appeared only where it had to, attached to decisions that removed her access, restricted her role, and dissolved the systems she had used to watch everyone else. There was no farewell email, no last meeting where she addressed the neighborhood. One week she was everywhere, issuing reminders and warnings, and the next she was functionally absent, her authority reduced to a line item in a report most people skimmed before moving on. That disappearance was the most fitting end to someone who had relied so heavily on visibility to maintain control. The neighborhood adjusted faster than I expected. Without constant oversight, people didn't descend into chaos like she had always warned. Lawns stayed trimmed, trash cans went out and came back in. Kids rode bikes without glancing at cameras. Conversations on sidewalks grew longer, less guarded. The fear that had been normalized for years evaporated once it was no longer reinforced daily. People realized they had been policing themselves on her behalf, internalizing rules that existed more in her tone than in any bylaw. Removing her influence didn't create disorder, it exposed how unnecessary it had been. For me, the end was even quieter. My internet stabilized completely once the unauthorized data spikes. No more ghost devices reconnecting in the background. My home returned to being what it was supposed to be, a private space, not a node in someone else's system. I didn't attend the meetings where the board restructured, didn't volunteer for committees, didn't step into any role of authority myself. I had no interest in replacing her. The victory wasn't about taking control, it was about removing it from the wrong hands. Occasionally someone would thank me in passing, usually with a tone that suggested they still weren't sure how to process what had happened. I accepted those thanks politely and moved on. This wasn't a story I needed to relive or retell endlessly. It had done its work. HOA Karen had called 911, expecting validation, expecting uniforms to reinforce her dominance. Instead, she had exposed herself to scrutiny she couldn't manage, and the system she built to watch others had been turned back on her, without emotion or mercy. That reversal didn't require revenge or speeches. It required patience, evidence, and the willingness to let professionals do what they do best. The last time I thought about her was when I walked past the HOA office one evening and noticed the windows were dark, no monitors glowing, no figures inside, just an empty room reflecting the streetlights back at themselves. It struck me then how completely her presence had vanished, how thoroughly her power had dissolved once it was questioned. There was nothing left to argue with, nothing left to fear, nothing left to perform against. The neighborhood had moved on without ceremony. I went home, closed my door, and logged on to my network. One device connected, mine. No alerts, no warnings, no access requests waiting in the background. Whatever HOA Karen thought she had built, whatever authority she believed she wielded, it ended without spectacle. She didn't get the confrontation she wanted, or the control she craved. She didn't even get a final word. HOA Karen went silent.